So in a sense, titled this sort of hands-on history exploring the 1879 English through the war through artifacts. I do have a few artifacts that are here on campus, including some up here that will be available at the end to come and sort of really hold and look at. When I talk to any audience, philatelic, postal, military history, whatever form may be, I always try to talk about history in there's sort of three ways you can engage a historical subject. One is you can live it. You can actually be a veteran in a military history circumstance or talking with someone that actually took part in whatever battle, whatever engagement, whatever service is related to the history of your interest. So if it's a World War II interest, then of course you've got, if you're talking with a World War II veteran, that's one-on-one to actually be lived history. Then there's the place, the concept of actually going to the place where whatever history took shape. So if it's, again, World War II, it's going to the D-Day landing sites in Normandy in France and actually walking the ground. Even if you're not there with someone who lived the experience, you can kind of become a little bit more familiar with what the essence of that place is by actually going and walking it with your own feet. And then there's the artifact, which really is, as we get, especially for the Anglo-Sudan War, which was 145 years ago, there aren't any more living veterans. Though interestingly, there were veterans alive from the Zulu War into the 1950s, to give you a sense of. So it's within living memory that there were living veterans, but no longer. The place, it's funny, whenever I talk about the Anglo-Zulu War, I'm never actually here in Southern Africa or in South Africa. So the place is actually very close to all of you relative to everyone else in the world that I would talk to. So that's about going back to the battlefields in traditional Zululand. And then there's the artifacts, which of course take many different shapes, and we're going to talk about artifacts, Polson and otherwise, today. My journey really to standing here with you began over 30 years ago when a teacher put some stamps in my hand, just like this, a big pile of stamps, to do a geography lesson. I pulled out a few of them and remember holding 8 or 10 stamps from 8 or 10 different countries all at the same time. And I thought it was magic, and I still do. And the idea that I could sort of hold a different place, a different time, all in sort of these very simple, seemingly weightless objects was just amazing. So at age 7, I become a stamp collector and begin a path of joining a local society and started getting very involved very quickly. My father would tell you if he was standing here that Philately was a blessing because he was worried that I would eventually start hoarding and collecting like rubber bands or like junk toys from restaurants or any other variety of thing that is not nearly as fulfilling as we all know Philately and our collecting in this area can be. So a few years later, I was in England for the very first time. It was 1997. It was there actually the week that Princess Diana died. I arrived the weekend before she died in a car accident. And that first day, I arrived in the home of the postage stamp, where the penny black was born. I couldn't have been more excited to be on the ground for that reason alone. And so we get to the hotel. My brother and sister and my parents, brother and sister are younger than I am, wanted to take a nap because of the jet lag of coming over the Atlantic. And I was just, boom, I couldn't imagine going to sleep if I had just arrived in London. So my parents said, well, Alex, you've got to watch, go to the hotel front desk, get a map, have them circle where the hotel is, and come back in 3 hours. I said, okay. And so I have an 8, 5, and 2-year-old children, and I kind of asked myself as my oldest approaches the age of 11, would I do the same thing if presented with the same opportunity? And at this point, I'm trending towards yes, but I'll see where I am when she's 11. No smartphone, no nothing. Actually, they forgot to give me money. I had no money on me. So I made my way down towards Buckingham Palace, and as I go from Buckingham Palace, being sitting outside, to walking towards Parliament, I pass by the Guards Museum, the Royal Guard regiments that are the ones that do the Trooping of the Colour or the Changing the Guards at different royal palaces. So that's the museum that is really dedicated to all 5 Guard regiments. And inside, I couldn't get into the museum because I didn't have the £2 for admission or whatever it was, but I could go in the gift shop. And this is a picture of what part of the gift shop looked like. And it had toy soldiers, 54mm toy soldiers, from wall to wall, and it was extraordinary. And it hit me like a lightning bolt, the same way that the stamps had 4 years earlier. And actually down here, right over there in the middle case, was the sort of combined Rorschrift and Isamawana Anglo-Zulu War display. And I spent the rest of my sort of 2 hours, 2.5 hours I had left in that store, and then went back every single day for the 6 days we were there, and basically sought to examine every single figure they had in every single case, and decided that I wanted to pick one of these areas to both collect toy soldiers and then to explore the philately and postal history aspects as well. So I chose the Anglo-Zulu War because it was the one campaign that they had a diorama that I, to that point, knew nothing about. They had one about World War II and World War I, and they had a Waterloo display, and I basically said, just the Anglo-Zulu War, and the shop owner sort of adopted me for the whole week, was explaining the contours of the story. The Zulus were, fighting the British to maintain the independence of their kingdom. I'm an American, and we had fought the British to, of course, get our independence. And so I saw this, as an 11-year-old would see things, I saw this, sort of camaraderie with Zulus to Americans. My name is Alex, Z for Zulu, A to Z, I don't know, there's all these reasons, but I fell into the Zulu War world. And over the course of about 10 years, recreated with mowing my neighbor's lawns, money, and every other imaginable small, odd job that a little kid can do, collected these one at a time. So this is the end result of a 10-year progress that started on that day in August 1997 to basically recreate, in this case, a portion of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. But for as much as I love the toy soldiers, I really wanted to be a collector of the philately of the Anglo-Zulu War. So I get back in 1997, in 11, I go to the very first sort of local society show, exhibition that they had in the stamp world near where I lived, and I walk in and I start going down all the dealers, and I knew most of them, and said, oh, I have a new area of interest, I'm really interested now in covers and letters and postal history of the Anglo-Zulu War. And to a T, they either said, I don't know what that is, I don't think I have anything, or, do you mean the Anglo-Boer War? I said, no, I mean the Anglo-Zulu War. So that continued on for years, where I was basically running into dead end after dead end after dead end after dead end. And obviously I lived in the wrong country. Now, I didn't think about how much more difficult it would be to collect philately in the United States and where I was based and where I was living. And if I only picked World War I or World War II, how much different my life would have been as a result of, from a collecting perspective, but it would not have been nearly as exciting as what I'm going to share with you in terms of my journey. So it would take, I was basically in university before the first piece of Zulu War-related postal history was even put into my hands. And it was this item here, sent by an officer of the 60th Rifles with a 6 penny paid for transit from within Zululand during the campaign back to England. And of course it was like the greatest, coolest thing ever. Since everyone here is basically philatelically engaged in some way, I'll comment on an acquisition thing that I'm certain has happened to every single one of you, whether you want to admit it or not, which is, of course, the first item that I actually came across was the one that I basically overpaid the most for, which is very typical when you go into any field. It's like when you really know the least about something, that's the thing you sort of overpay for, but it was totally worth it because it basically, I went from being a book, a modern book collector of the Zulu War, different books that were coming out, in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, and it went from a book and toy soldier collector. The toy soldiers instantly stopped, and then I became basically just focused on philately, even though I only had at that point one cover and no letter. So, skipping the story a little bit, so I found other ways to get more postal history items in the United States. I started traveling to the UK when I was in university, and afterwards I worked for the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. for the National Postal Museum. So I was going over to the UK for work with them and was building on extra days to basically figure out how can I find the collectors and dealers and auction houses, and how do I learn more about this material. So that's occurring, along the way, and then I encounter someone that hands me the item on the right. South African Traveler's Handbook was published right after the war began, so the war is January to July of 1879. And right after the invasion kicks off, this was already in the works by the writer, but it's basically a Zulu to English and other African language pocket dictionary that the War Department in the UK rushed out and basically got into the hands of a variety of officers so that they could take it with them in a re-invasion that would go in February, March back to Zululand. This actually is the War Department's library's copy. And so this ephemera book dealer hands this to me and says, Alex, you're into the Zulu War, you've got to have one of these. And I said, that's nice. That's not really my focus. I'm really interested in the postal history. And he goes, no, you don't understand. His pitch to me was to really get into your field, you have to understand all of the sort of sides, and what we now say is the context philately, of your interest. So consider that while they're writing these letters and sending these covers that you want to collect, they're also using this book to engage, whether it be, locals, Zulus, whoever it may be. So, they weren't sitting naked in the middle of the field with no equipment around them, writing a letter. They had stuff, and that stuff influenced how they wrote. It influenced what equipment they had, what paper they had on them. And then he said, he goes, if this was a cover, Alex, you would have bought it, in a flash. And he was right. And then he said, I've never, he's probably been doing this for 30 years. He said, this is the first one I've ever come across. And if you ever find a second one, I'll buy it from you. I went, all right, that's interesting. And I bought this like 16 years ago, and I've still never seen another one. So it was a great moment for me because it basically opened up my mind to thinking about well beyond the postal side, not to supplant my philatelic postal interest, but rather to add on to it. Other types of things I was able to acquire in the United States and in that early time are, for example, things related to the very much the aftermath in the areas in the 20th century. So this is a picture of Makuzutra Buthelezi. This is a letter that he had signed in the 1980s while part of the KwaZulu Natal government. Other items related, of course, to the centenary and the stamps that came out, and this is again signed by Buthelezi at the ceremony in May of 1979. Buthelezi was interesting to me as from a collecting perspective because as soon as I decided I was going to choose the Anglo-Zulu War when I was in London, I turned to my father and said, I'm going to pick the Zulu War. He goes, I've got a movie to show you when we get home. And then, of course, I saw Zulu with Michael Caine and Stanley Baker. I'm a very unusual person to come out to the Zulu War because almost every other person I encounter in this collecting field, not philatelic, but in all the other aspects of Anglo-Zulu War collecting, most of them saw the movie first and then got interested in it, whereas I saw Toy Soldiers first and then saw the movie. Buthelezi plays his great-grandfather, King Cachoeira, in the movie. He's one of the few, he's the only person basically in a starring type role who plays his actual ancestor in the movie itself, which is pretty amazing. All right, so fast forwarding, I'm going to get into some of the artifacts in a second, but just continuing the story a little bit. So almost exactly 20 years to the day of my beginning the interest, I finally got myself to South Africa. And it's too delayed. I should have done everything I could to have come a lot sooner. But 7 years ago in 2017, I came. This is me actually near Shawi, very close to where the heliograph that they basically were signaling from the besieged British forces was set up. And it was a life-changing experience. So I moved from, I couldn't access, I was using books to read testimonies and other sort of excerpts from veterans, so that the lived piece of this, as close as I could get. And there was actually some recordings in the 1930s of some radio addresses that different prominent Zulu War veterans had done. So I had sort of listened to some voices, read their letters, read their excerpts. Then there's the place. And I finally achieved actually walking the battlefields. I spent 2 weeks going to all the principal battlefields in traditional Zululand, so not just to Sandalwana and Orange Drift, but from very obscure sort of corners of Zululand. And really found it to be amazing. And I fell in love with not only the Zulu War once again as I walked the fields, but actually it opened up my thinking to the Zulu cultural aspect of this, which was not necessarily military focused, but also how they lived: beadwork, basketry, pottery, other clothing elements. The effects of the war on Zulu people, women, and children after the war. So I went from collecting basically 1878 to 1880 from a philatelic perspective, and I had bought some other artifacts, militaria, but I was very focused on the 19th century, and then I basically exploded and decided that basically if it had to do with Zulu culture or the Anglo-Zulu history experience, I was interested. I didn't exactly share that my collecting interest had exploded to my wife, who of course would have gone nuts if she had heard what I was about to do. So we're going to dive a little bit into the postal history, just because we're, of course, here at the National Exhibition. So these are not now in order of how I acquired them. I'm now going to tell a bit of a story. So I'm not making any assumptions about what we know about the Anglo-Zulu War as a group here, but just really broad, very quick, sort of down and dirty description of what happened. Basically, the British are advanced. The British take over from the Dutch in the very first years of the 19th century, and there's this continued, which already existed, this continued movement of people Dutch descended Boers, as well as English British settlers that are basically moving. If my hand is South Africa, you all know the geography of your country way better than I do. This is how I always show South Africa to an audience. But basically, Cape Town's over here, Johannesburg's up here, traditional Zululand is far east away from Cape Town, basically, sort of where the earliest settlements were in the 1600s. And basically, there's a progression of white European settlers and colonial movement in an eastward direction, and they find themselves on the Zulu border effectively in the mid to, as we approach the 1870s. And basically, the Zulus are the last remaining independent African kingdom after the final of several frontier wars takes place, and so basically puts the British and sort of the European influence in Southern Africa on the Zulu border. Zululand had come together as a result of some adept diplomacy and military prowess of a king named Shaka in the early 19th century. And by the time of 1879, when the war breaks out, there had been a little over 50 years of what would be considered sort of an independent Zulu kingdom, if that can be said in that form. At the time, the king, Cetshwayo, was Shaka's nephew. So Shaka was assassinated by his younger brothers. So the first brother takes over from Shaka, then the next brother takes over, and it's the son of that younger brother that's the king. So Shaka's nephew is the king at the time in 1879. So cutting through, there's only been about 1,000 books written about this, so to cut through this in a matter of minutes is doing great shame and dishonor to all these authors and historians that spend lots of time giving all the details here. But basically, the British decided that they wanted to enact a policy of confederation here in Southern Africa to bring all the disparate colonial elements together into a form similar to what had been done in Canada in the previous decade in terms of confederation. And there was a gentleman named Sir Bartle Frere that was sent down here with basically the instructions to craft that sort of governing structure, but not to start a war. But he decides, in collaboration with the main British military commander on the ground, that that's exactly what they're going to do to basically force the Zulus into a position to capitulate, to basically remove the perceived threat of the Zulu independent kingdom on the border of the British colony Natal. So they put forward an ultimatum in early December of 1878. They give 1 month. The ultimatum includes disbanding the traditional Zulu military infrastructure and a variety of other customs that the Zulus were never going to do. It was intentionally meant to instigate a war, and the ultimatum on January 10th expires, and on the 11th, the British invade. This item on the left side here was written by a captain of the 24th named George Wardell. He's writing right at Helpmacar in late December, so it's during the period of the ultimatum and sort of is wearing down, but it's pretty clear as they're massing forces that they're going to invade at some point. And he's writing within the colony to a physician on Her Majesty's service in manuscript at the top. The cover to the right is sent by a lieutenant in the 24th as well, named Anstey, paying a 6-penny rate, sending to his father at his father's gentleman's club, the Wyndham Club in St. James Square in London. The letter still accompanies this item, and he's basically describing the movement up to the border and saying, we're likely to get this kicked off very soon. References that it's raining cats and dogs, which is a very interesting reference from a context perspective, because the British decide to invade in the height of summer, also the wet season, and they encounter all sorts of difficulties as they cross rivers because of the over-flooding. And so it's interesting to have had this letter reference that he's noticing all this rain. These two individuals, just a few weeks after they send these letters, would be dead on the battlefield of San Juan. So basically what happens is the British decide to send in 3 columns to invade Zululand, one along the coast, the ocean coast, in the south, one in the north, and one in the center, basically going due east. And the idea is to basically come at the Zulu capital, Ulundi, which is right in the center of the country, and basically force the Zulus to have a frontal confrontation. The central column has the main commander of the whole invasion, Lord Chelmsford, attached to it, and basically skipping over the details, but just to give you a sense, they arrive, they invade Zululand, they arrive at Isandlwana, they have their camp facing east towards Ulundi, and they're now trying to figure out where is the Zulu army, because there's the assumptions the Zulu army is potentially nearby, and they, through a combination of luck on the Zulu side, more than anything, the Brits discover some Zulus in the distance in a southeastern direction, so in the perspective sort of over there, Actually, I'll go to this one. So this is facing west. So the British camp was, oh, by the way, this image, by the way, oops. I forgot to mention, this is from the movie Zulu, the very beginning of the movie where you see the Zulus walking through the devastation of the British camp. So this is a photograph taken a couple months after the battle. You actually can still see skeletons all along the bottom as well as debris and wagons. But this is where the camp was. We're facing west at the Haimann Mountain. So this is the direction the camp was facing. And basically they decided that the Zulu army very well may be in that direction. And basically the commander decides to split his forces and takes about half his force in that direction to try to attempt to find and confront the Zulu army. But in fact, the Zulus were much, much closer and basically to the northeast. And they were basically over a ridge, which relative to the distance the general just gone was basically right next to them versus 10 plus miles away where he was going. On the morning of the 22nd, about 10:30 in the morning, there are some Zulus that are spotted up, or the camp thinks they spot some Zulus. They send some mounted men up to see what it is. They peer over the valley and they go, I can't even imagine what they said to themselves, but they notice between 20 and 25,000 Zulu warriors who then begin an attack. The attack is this famous sort of horns of the buffalo, a right flank horn, a left flank horn, and the head. And the head basically comes straight at the firing lines, and the British don't quite know what to make of what they've encountered because the general is out confronting the Zulus. So this must be some smaller war party. This can't possibly be the Zulu army because the general's fighting the Zulu army. And it was devastation. So over 1,300 British and other related colonial troops were killed. It's the single greatest defeat of a British field force at the hands of a non-mechanized army in the 19th century. It is a startling reversal of fortunes for the British, especially for an invasion that was not authorized by the home government, an intention to try to basically get the Zulus to capitulate before they were admonished by the home government. It takes about 6 weeks at this point for information to go from the heart of Zululand to London and then to have it come back to them. So before they can be told to stop, they were hoping to finish the war. So at the time that photograph was taken, there were a series of burial parties that came through. Every artifact, everything I'm showing you is actually an artifact that is in my collection. So these are not photographs from somewhere else. This is a canteen, a wagon canteen. You can see them attached to the wagons in these London Illustrated news pieces. They basically would be all along these very large wagons as they invaded Zululand. And this was picked up by a trooper of the Natal Mounted Police during one of the burial expeditions around the time that photograph was taken. So when we talk about sort of artifacts and their connection to place, those postal artifacts sent by Wardell and Anstey are really these incredible last moments of these men's lives, and really only sort of in an artifact form, in a postal form, but also artifacts on the battlefields are very interesting as well in terms of what their attribution is, and there's a whole other military collecting world that connects to. This is the telegram marked his last by his father, notifying Anstey's father to the Wyndham Club, again, that he is likely killed on the 22nd of January. So both his last letters and others from Anstey, as well as the final sort of communication out of South Africa through a telegram, official telegram, that his son had been killed. So by about 2:30 in the afternoon, the Battle of Haimann is basically completed. There were 4 regiments, Zulu regiments, that decided they still wanted in on the action and had not participated in the initial, basically the main Battle of Haimann. They decided they were going to cross the Buffalo River, the traditional border between the colony of Natal and Zululand, against the orders of the king. They were going to attack a small mission station called Rorke's Drift. It becomes quite famous because of the defense of Rorke's Drift. So it was a terrible battle in many respects. 130-ish British and colonial troops, including men that were wounded and sick in the hospital. It's the picture on right here gives a sense of the perspective of the Zulus from the first moment of the attack. So basically the Zulus are coming up and they're basically rushing up on what there were biscuit box and mealy bag barricades that were made by the defenders. The defense was led by a number of people, but prominently is Gombo Bromhead and John Chard, most famously played by Michael Caine and Stanley Baker. Imagine how you would feel if basically what you had done all this, you'd survived the Zulu War, you received the Victoria Cross, and then sometime in the 1960s, 2 actors basically become the people you're going to be most associated with for the rest of the living memory of you. So whenever someone says Gonville Bromhead, as portrayed by Michael Caine in the movie, or John Chard, as portrayed by Stanley Baker. So I had a chance to actually bring an artifact that is one of the very few material pieces that was actually at the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which is a house of kit. I actually have it here to hand anyone that would be interested to hold it at the end. And what it basically is a piece of kit that is assigned at the moment that you join the regiment. This was assigned to Private William Beckett in 1875 when he joined the regiment in Brecon in Wales. And it's where you keep your shaving kit and your eating utensils. And so the reason why it's inscribed to you is you don't want to mix up your shaving kit and your utensils with anyone else. Almost nothing else is part of the kit of the 19th century Imperial British soldier is marked. They don't have their names over everything like we do in traditional kit today, or soldier's kit. I took this photograph on Monday. It's pretty exciting for me to do this and to talk about it. This is actually right above, inside of the building that is the hospital, which was burned down in the battle itself, which took place between 4:30 in the afternoon on the 22nd. So the same day as the Southern One, just a few hours later, and lasted into the early morning hours, about 12 hours. And the British did successfully hold out against this force, about 3,500 to 4,000 Zulus. Private Beckett was a patient of the hospital and was one of the defenders in the building. The Zulus got into the building and actually lit a fire and burned it down. Beckett was stabbed in the abdomen during the fighting inside the hospital, made his way out in the dark and hid in the brush, but died of his wounds for just a few hours after the battle had completed, after he'd been found by his comrades. There's a section of the hospital which had been rebuilt where they actually have the original, part of the original foundation visible to the visitor. So this is Beckett's house and kit returning to Rorke's Drift. On top of the plexiglass that's over the original foundation, and this would have been on the side of the building where he would have exited, basically where he would have exited, along with the Martini Henry and Spear, which are both here as part of the Kedar Lodge display at the very front. I encourage you, if you're interested to sort of handle real and interesting three-dimensional artifacts, to make your way over there and pick up the Martini Henry or any Zulu weapons that are there. Beckett's house and kit was sent back with his personal effects to his family. His posthumously awarded campaign medal was then given to the family, and they stored his medal wrapped up in this kit, in this house and kit, for 120 years before they sold it almost exactly 25 years ago. And so I'm very fortunate because the person that bought it in 1999 when it was sold, I was 13 years old. I wasn't buying major expensive campaign medals of the English Civil War. But I was very fortunate because they decided to split the two, which is totally insane from my perspective because Beckett used this piece of kit every single day that he was in South Africa from 1877 until the morning of the battle. It survived the Battle of Rorke's Drift itself. So it's about as attributable of an artifact as possible to a place and a time and a person. Beckett never touched his medal. He never saw it. He never, almost certainly never came to South Africa at any point. So to me, the most interesting artifact by far in terms of what it means to hold and touch history is this item. And the medal is sort of, who cares? Now, I say that to be very careful because lots of people that are not in the philatelic space would feel the same way about the envelopes, for example, when they're holding the letter. And so it's about trying to see it from all sides and perspectives. So all these objects and artifacts are part of the total story. But when you think about the two next to each other, one is very connected to the history and the person, the other one really is just an afterthought, basically. I had a chance also to bring Beckett's house of kit to the place where he's buried at Rorke's Drift. And you can see he died of his wounds, and Beckett is at the top of these two. And this is basically it's effectively a mass grave for these men, the British that died at Rorke's Drift. There's also a grave and a marker for Zulus that were buried there as well. So it's pretty amazing to actually have the opportunity to combine, again, there's no veterans I can engage with, but I brought place and artifact together. And that really was very special, just 40 hours ago, basically. So we're talking again about the famous figures of the Zulu War. So that is that is John Chard, and that is Gonville Bromhead, and then there's Michael Caine as Bromhead, and Stanley Baker as John Chard. So when I was starting to collect, I realized that if I was ever going to do anything really interesting, exhibit, display, whatever, talk to the public, and make the postal objects the sort of the centerpiece, because again, at my core, I'm a philatelist, and that was the way I wanted to be able to convey this amazing story to the world in whatever form I was going to do. Was I going to write a book? Was I going to do a display. It didn't matter. I needed to make sure that the general public, whoever I was going to engage, would see this material and be able to connect with it. So I understood when I first found my very first Zulu War covers, I said, well, it may cost me an arm and a leg, the naming rights of my first child, but I'm going to need something from Gonville Bromhead. And I'm going to need something from John Chard because everyone's going to ask, well, what about the Rourke Striff guys, and what about the Sons of Wanted? So I had to think about this, and I'm very fortunate that I've been able to collect and have a letter sent by John Chard from the campaign itself. It's after the battle when they're waiting on the border for a re-invasion to take place. So after the battle, they send the one Rourke Striff. The invasion is ground to a halt. There are other military actions that the Zulus hold off the British in different places in January, February, March, and they're basically waiting for a re-invasion. This is a letter where Chard is basically writing to a senior officer of the Royal Engineers and is effectively complaining about the progress, like basically why hasn't this kicked off to get this campaign underway. And then on the right side is a letter written by Gonville Bromhead from Rourke Striff, and he's writing to his sister, and he basically, it's written 3 months to the day, April 22nd, which is just amazing. Oh, it's amazing. Was never famous for writing long letters. There's actually only, as far as I know, 2 letters of his in private hands, and this is one of them. He basically makes a reference to, haven't seen much of our friends, the Zulus, these days, but I know that events are coming to a head to bring this campaign to a close. I also have, for anyone's interest, a chance to hold this letter. It's about as close as I can possibly get you to one of the most famous, both from a historical perspective, but also from a popular culture perspective, to the person that basically launched Michael Caine's career. Which again, I feel so bad making Bromhead and Michael Caine so tied together. But as Michael Caine, I believe this week just turned 91, it's worth mentioning. So that's Gonville Bromhead writing from Rourke Striff. I also had a chance, of course, to take Bromhead's letter back to Rourke Striff, and that's me, just 2 days ago with his letter. And again, the last time it was there almost certainly was April 22nd, April 23rd of 1879, over 145 years ago. So why do I do all this? It's because in the end, I'm trying to find ways of catching people's attention. I don't mean yours, I'm talking now in a macro sense. As I go out and start talking about the Zulu War and continue to other audiences, I want them to see and realize that postal artifacts and other key pieces of history, artifact pieces, are the way that you really can connect with these places, even if you can't visit. But if you can visit, what better way to basically memorialize and or to expand your knowledge than if you visited these places, whether it be a World War I battlefield, a World War II battlefield, Sri Lanka, whatever it may be, that a way that you can continue your engagement with that history is to begin collecting and studying. I, of course, would argue, and all of you would as well, the postal history and philatelic elements as really the best way to do so. A few more objects that are just particularly interesting. This is a telegram announcing the capture of Cachoeira. So the war is brought to a close on July 4th, 1879. The British basically send a reinvasion force. They finish off the Zulu army at a central key battle on July 4th. The Zulu king Cachoeira escapes, and he makes his way, evades the British and capture him until the end of August, so about 6-7 weeks. And this is announcing his capture to one of the main commanders in the field. These are 2 different ends of the war. This is one of the very earliest newspapers that came out right after the news had come into the colony. Basically, so the 23rd, basically everyone becomes aware that they're in this battle, this major setback. Part of the Zulus going to invade. They have no idea what's going to happen because the Zulus would cross the border to attack Rourke Striff. Maybe they'll continue attacking across the border. Who knows? And so, to me, this was actually, I found this before I really got into the more artifacts, but again, a newspaper, though sent to the mail, which really got my postal history, philatelic fires burning, but it got me thinking more about what were the other things that the people in the colony were reading and looking at and using. And it talks about the barricading of different buildings in the colony in preparation for a Zulu attack. On the right side is the other end of this story, which is in 1879, the Zulu king is taken to the castle in Cape Town, and is held there for basically 3 years. This is in February of 1882, so towards the end of the time that he's there. He's visited by some European visitors, and he was taking any visitors he could because he was trying to exert influence and pressure on the government to let him return to be king of Zululand. So they visit him, and they basically visit him, and the next day send him a letter into the castle and ask him if he could sign his name. And He does on the other side of the letter. It's basically the only letter, only postal item that Quechua ever signed. The reason why this is interesting about the signatures is what he usually did is the officer that was in charge of his captivity taught him how to write his name. It's the only English script he learned how to write. And he would write his name over and over and over again on these blue slips of paper, and he would cut them out and he would give them to people. So often when you see his signature in the collecting world, they're on little blue slips of paper. What I believe occurred is that he had run out of blue slips of paper from the cutting out from the previous visitors, or had one or two but didn't have another, whatever it may be. There's no way he would have sat there with people looking on to write his name. It would have been there would have been a propriety element of that. He would not want to embarrass himself. It would have been unrelated. He would say, I'm sorry, I don't have any more, and would not have signed any more. So what I believe occurred here basically is that when he ran out, it's sort of like, hey, well, would you please send us or send out one of your signatures? And so it's just so wonderful that he didn't cut one of the blue slips of paper if he had made more, but instead signed the letter. So really an amazing, amazing object. So of course, we fast forward to the movie. This is a script that I have. One of the director's used scripts. The movie was filmed at the Royal Natal National Park. I think I'm messing that up. So actually, interestingly, not in sort of the traditional Zulu area in the Drakensberg Mountains. It's an amazing place to go if you're interested in the movie because they had to build the set and they had to take it all down. So all of the scenery from the movie is still exactly as it was in 1963 when they filmed it. So I've actually walked the field with an iPad, basically watching the movie. And as you're watching, you're just paying attention to the background. Where's this? Oh, there it is. Where's this? Classic Hollywood nonsense, of course, comes out of this because you're watching the movie and you say, okay, I now see the Zulus are running, that direction. I see the background. And then the next scene is a cut to the British opening fire. And when you actually pay attention to where they're opening fire, they're like shooting in that direction. So you can get a real sense of how movies are made and how they really get the best shot. So how do I collect the movie philatelically? It was actually a tremendous challenge. And the only object I've really come across that really fits this is this. It's a ticket to the premiere of Zulu in Thailand with Thai tax stamps on it. And that's a picture of the premiere of Zulu in Thailand where this was used. So pretty amazing. Incredibly, like everything, this was like the least expensive thing I've ever bought for my Zulu collection. Probably the thing that if there's a fire I would grab first. I'm, of course, joking in one sense, but it's so rare, such an unusual item. And again, the person who had it was was a movie memorabilia person. And of course, all I cared about were those Thai tax stamps on the side of it. So to me, that was the really exciting thing, was a way to finally connect the philately to these other elements. In 1979, there was a movie called Zulu Dawn with Peter O'Toole and Burt Lancaster. And so I was also trying to figure out how can I collect that philatelically. And then one day I found an unbelievable envelope. It's about this big that has this spear, in color printed spear, blasting through the envelope basically, but in 2 dimensions. And it included a packet of movie theater promotional items that they used and would set up around the theater during the premiere, which was just amazing. But if it didn't have the envelope, though those would be cool, the envelope was really what I was after. All right, so what was the goal of all this? And basically in 2015, I was asked by the Royal Philatelistry Society in London, the president at the time named Patrick Masellis, if I'd be willing to do a 5 p.m. display. Now, the Royal Philatelistry Society in London, like lots of other royals, has these traditions around what these displays are supposed to be. A 5 p.m. is basically a 45-minute presentation. About a couple hours in the afternoon, you set up your display, which are typically on 2-dimensional pages like what we have here at the exhibition. And I, at the time, had Zulu shields and other 3-dimensional artifacts, and I really resisted. I really did not want to show the postal objects on their own, because to me, there's not a criticism, a comment about anything, it's just my own preferences. I felt that every postal object I had was made more impressive of an object when shown in tandem with other artifacts that were related to the same moment, the same person, whatever it may be. And so I said, Patrick, could I maybe convince you to let me set up maybe a couple-week-long display with 3-dimensional objects? And that turned into an 8-year-long odyssey, and what you're seeing here is almost exactly 1 year ago of us moving in 14 2-meter tall by 1.2 meter cases into one of the main rooms at the building at 15 Church Lane for the Royal in London. I convinced them to do things that they probably never thought they were going to do. We put up these frames into the background so we could basically try to make people at least come a little bit out of the street of London, come into South Africa, come into traditional Zululand a little bit, and create these are 7+ foot tall long banners. Now the preparation for this was immense. So though I was asked in 2015, the plan was we were going to have 4 years. We were planning on opening on the 140th anniversary of the war in 2019. So of course, classically, for 95 years, what did they decide to do? They decided to sell the building on me. So they were moving buildings, and we decided, okay, we probably shouldn't have it in the building that we're about to move out of. So we'll move it to 2021. And so what happens in 2020? COVID and lockdown. So two things that hadn't happened in basically almost 100 years, a global pandemic of that scale, and the royal moving buildings, both happened to me in a matter of like 36 months. And so, of course, it's scheduled so we then move it to 2023, and I'm thinking to myself, great, what else is going to happen that's going to delay this? And I'm thinking, perfect, Queen Elizabeth's going to die right before the exhibition. And so, unbelievably, she died in September of 2022, when we were about, 10 months out. And then, of course, when was Charles going to be coronated? And thankfully, he was coronated in May. I had the great privilege of meeting Queen Elizabeth in 2019 at the Royal representing the United States, and the reason I was included was because of the effort that we had underway. And at that time, the exhibition was like, it was going to be like 18 months after that. So we were really in the rev-up period, and of course the delay happened. It was one of the last public events that she did outside of the Royal Palace, was coming to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Royal Philharmonic Society in London, and to celebrate the opening of the new building. The previous time that she had been there was in 1969, 50 years earlier, for the 100th anniversary, which was just amazing. So that was really special. This just gives you a sense of my collection. As crazy as this sounds, until it was in these display cases, I had never actually seen all of the material in my collection in one room, ever. Because it basically existed in multiple storage places, storing Zulu shields all over the place, and artifacts. So it really was an immense amount of effort. The objective was basically to tell the Zulu War, the story of the Zulu War, the lead up to the war itself, but using all the objects. And basically, you can see it's all in a three-dimensional environment. In Philately, of course, we have exhibitions and competitive exhibiting, all these elements that make it much easier for us to have two-dimensional spaces. But I will tell you that there is something that really makes even a two-dimensional object, like a cover or letter, it changes the perspective to the viewer if you put it in a three-dimensional context. And so we really spent a lot of time thinking about little display stands and how to really make multi-dimensional elements of two-dimensional artifacts in many cases, which were postal and philatelic related. So it just gives you a sense of this. Now, I'm also interested in trying to find other ways of engaging history. So we had two 6-by-8 foot dioramas, one of Rorschrift and the other one of a battle called Battle of Tombe, which the Zulus had routed accompanied the 80th. So this is the Zulu victory diorama part of it. The Rorschrift is right there. We welcomed over 2,100 visitors from 29 countries. I mentioned that earlier today. And it really was an amazing experience to see. Probably about 90% of the visitors were not philatelists, had never thought of postal history in any meaningful way as a way to connect with their area of history and interest and culture. We had all ages, demographics, and again, more than 50% of the artifacts were postal and philatelic artifacts. So every part of the story, every case, was basically about half philatelic, half postal, and half everything else. And it brought some pretty amazing people out. There's this guy that came that had just had a recent tattoo of the Zulu shield on. How many of you, and roll up your sleeves to show us all, have put your favorite stamp as a tattoo on your arm? I mention that only to simply say that there are other areas of collecting and passion in history that have incredibly passionate people like this gentleman. And again, there are opportunities for us in Philately to engage the people that have passion in other areas and to see an opportunity to collect, study, or engage with what we do as well. Of course, we had to have a museum shop. So this was a little shop that we set up in the Stockholmian room, which was really great. And it really was amazing. We put out a catalog. Assuming that FedEx does arrive, we are planning to have about 15 or so catalogs available for sale here to benefit the South African Federation. If they arrive, I will hopefully, please ask me tomorrow or the next day if you're interested in buying one. It was a 2-year-long effort to basically craft all of 550 artifacts into this narrative. So everything that was on display at the exhibition is depicted in the book. There's a 1906 Rebellion exhibit that I brought here as well that was a very good friend of mine in the United States' exhibit, and that's also in the book, so everything that's depicted in that exhibit is in there as well. We had reenactors come. So again, how many of you have been interested in the military postal history area and thought about trying to excite the public by inviting some people that are interested in the equipment and reenacting space? Other ways to think about engaging philately. This is actually a picture of the audience at the opening. And what they're looking at is Makuzutu Buthelezi, in one of his last official acts before he passed away, wrote an official letter of welcome for the exhibition and did a video welcome as well. And it's on YouTube if you're interested in seeing it. At 95, it was extraordinary to have him talk about philatelic and postal artifacts in his letter and in a video, and talking about the shared history that the Zulus and the British have about this dynamic and tragic history, but it is a shared history. And it was one of the most incredible honors that I've ever and never could imagine having him. Again, so you consider the great-grandson of the Zulu king. His mother, Ogogo, was the person who trained and taught all of the Zulus who were extras in the movie Zulu, the war chants they used in the movies. Amazing connections of just this one person. Traditional Prime Minister of the Zulu people for over 70 years. To have him do that, and he passed away just a few weeks after the exhibition closed last August. We had a 4-day-long symposium, 30 different speakers. Only about 7 of them were postal or philatelic focused, and the rest were military history, African cultural history. We had a PhD graduates in English literature come and talk about poems of the Zulu War. So all of the different ways that we could thematically approach this subject. And of course, the idea was every attendee is coming to the Royal Philatelic Society in London. So they're inside of our space of Philately in London. So we've got them through the door. What can we show them? How can we demonstrate that we have something to offer? We did all sorts of stuff. I'm doing this presentation now as a 2-dimensional PowerPoint show. I do have a few 3-dimensional artifacts, but we did a whole symposium. We had 450 people come through during those 4 days of that symposium. How better to talk about the uniforms and the kit of the Zulu War and the different British and Imperial troops of the Zulu War than having real-life people come in that kit, and instead of having a bunch of 2-dimensional PowerPoint pictures, actually standing up there and having someone explain what the kit looks like as they turn around and pull out their swords and Martini Henry rifles. So again, how are ways that what we do in philately and postal history can we again try to excite the public by bringing other ways of exploring what we do? We had Zulu Shield biscuits. We had an artist on site for almost 3 weeks who was basically painting different things that he saw in the gallery and painting the gallery, which is really quite wonderful. And of course, we had toy soldiers available for sale because I had to pass along the good karma of what happened to me when I was 11 and the number of kids that came through and saw these toy soldiers. It was emotional because I really saw something special happening. And again, whether it's the stamps that we put in someone's hand and we just have to introduce it just the right way so that magic can take place, or a toy soldier, it doesn't matter. Anything that excites a young person's interest to explore history, heritage, and culture further is effectively a win for Philately and all the hobbies and pursuits that focus on history and collecting. Now, this is a picture of my 5-year-old son from about 2 months ago. And I took him, his name is Winston, after a particularly famous American-British Prime Minister named Churchill. Don't forget his mother was American. And I believe he had some fame that took place down here in Southern Africa that might have launched his political career. So that's my son Winston. I took him to the Guards Museum, the museum that started my interest in the Anglo-Zulu War with that toy soldier display. And I brought him there because I had had a pretty incredible invitation a couple months earlier. And that was to go give a presentation to the officers of the Irish Guards at their base in Aldershot. So I had a chance to return and not just go to the museum where the inspiration for this passion begun, but actually to tell the officers of the Irish Guards whose museum had done it about what their history and heritage had excited in me, and how the impact that they have and the opportunities they have are well beyond what they may realize. And of course, what did we bring? I brought these objects. I brought other pulsar objects, other three-dimensional objects. It was, again, to try to put into the hands of the people who are living, back to the place and artifact, who are living history today, who decades from now, most of the Irish Guards, their area is Africa. So if there are British peace enforcement or support British troops in Africa, they're Irish Guards. That's who's here in Africa. So, the connection of Africa, all these different pieces. So it was really an amazing experience. My son thought it was the greatest thing ever. Also the chance to sort of sit on a vehicle, thought that was fantastic. Other elements of kit that they brought out was amazing. So with that, I wanted to show a picture of my family. This is my long-suffering wife, Sarah. These are my daughters, Corinne and Georgie. And this is during the time we had in the UK last summer. And so my wife, if you asked her if she was here, what do you collect? She'd say, I collect one philatelist, and that's all that I can possibly stand. And just before I finish here, to simply say that this is my friend Vince King, who passed away a week ago. You may have had some recognition of him. He had has written several articles, but his focus over the last couple of years has been trying to make three-dimensional artifacts part of the traditional execution of competitive exhibiting. So what you see behind him are acrylic cases that are in some cases 5 to 10 centimeters out of the display frame itself. And he's an engineer, but was an engineer by training, and basically designed a whole concept around how to bring more three-dimensional artifacts into the traditional, in quotes, framework of competitive exhibiting. And tragically passed away from cancer at the age of 71, just 8 days ago. And with that, in like 50 minutes, I was trying to make, trying to be thoughtful of everyone's time. As everyone mentioned in here, I'd love to take your questions or comments, and then I'm happy to chat with anyone offline. And as I said, these objects are up here. If you really want to kind of feel, as close as I can get you to the Battle of Orc's Drift, even if you walk the ground itself, but to actually have an artifact to understand and connect with something that was actually at the battle, attributably at the battle. And then, of course, down the run, the Victoria Cross recipient and his letter from Orc's Drift. So, yes, thank you for your kind attention, and I would take any questions. Any questions? Or yes, please.
So if I can summarize, context philately is actually open class philately, three-dimensional.
So it's funny, because actually I'm going to push back really, really hard. No, context philately is not open class philately in any way. Because context philately is not regimented, it is not, does not have any boundaries to what direction or what it can be. Open class philately has points, has criteria, has proportions of philatelic material versus non-philatelic material. Open class philately is, I think, an evolution of where competitive exhibiting blessedly is going, but actually context philately is, I would call it, it's a way of thinking.
But then what will be your criteria for judging?
I personally do not believe that competitive exhibiting has a future in its current form. Not to cause duress. But honestly, the competitive exhibiting has been one of the great drivers of the marketplace of philately for over 50 years. But I believe that in order to engage a new generation of philatelists and postal historians, we have unfortunately almost over-regimented and regulated ourselves to a point of making the entry into our field very unwelcoming. And so in a sense, context philately is about reimagining how we talk about philately, how we talk about the objects, how we study, how we show what we study to other fields, how we bring other fields into what we do. So context philately is maybe a way of thinking about different ways of collecting, different ways of studying, which may influence how you may mount or display what you do in open philately or other areas of competitive philately, but they are unrelated. And the reason I'm saying it that way is because the objective of context philately is not to create another class of competitive exhibiting or to alter open philately or social philately exhibiting. It's simply that it's meant to be a jolt. It's meant to say to all of us, maybe there's other ways that we should be looking at the material we collect and study. Maybe there's other ways we should be engaging other fields of study from natural sciences, technology, engineering, history, literature, and ways that we can bring them in. But the number of times I've seen people who are not philatelists or postal historians come to a national exhibition, and one of the very first things we show them, because it's what we so dominate our attention to, are these frames that we have there. Notice the first thing you see when you walk in the building is the frames. Yes, you've got the desks, but basically the frames is the first thing. The problem, though, is that as soon as you show someone that who's not a philatelist or postal historian, and they're like, well, what is the purpose of these? And it's like, oh, well, they're in competition, this and that. You're like losing people before we've even begun. So the perspective of context philately is that we should be thinking about different ways of displaying, showing, exploring, talking about philately generally to be more focused on expanding our own knowledge and engaging people outside of our field.
Okay, so then the purpose is not for competition, it is actually breaking philately open for a broader audience.
Yes.
Yes, no, I mean, open class, they started well and they now
Over-regulated.
they stuffed it up.
They
so many rules that, I mean,
They summed it badly. But here's the thing, exhibiting always wants regimentation because you have to be able to have the same exhibit basically get approximately the same points, otherwise you create chaos from the perspective of competitive exhibiting. My perspective basically is that if you look at the viewership on YouTube, if you look at online forums, if you look at where young people are coming at philately, and there are young people engaging in philately worldwide, they have nothing to do with competitive exhibiting, which means that competitive exhibiting is time limited. At this point, it will have to change dramatically in order to survive. But actually, philately is thriving because young people in particular are looking at philatelic objects and being creative with them. They're making YouTube videos. They're making different types of web projects. They're making, doing things on Instagram. They are in effect being context philatelists in a sense, and not allowing regimentation around competition. And I think in the end, it's natural for humans to want to compete. I totally get it. But actually, it's funny how my non-philatelist friends look at what amounts to competitive exhibiting in philately, and like they don't get it. Because they're like, isn't it all a subjective area of study that people choose what they're going to exhibit, and they're being judged based on like how they put together a story, but every exhibit is a different story, and every exhibit is of different importance and consequence. It befuddles people. And I personally believe that exhibitions like this, imagine the power of them if we could basically re-excite philately, organized philately as it is today, to simply come to an exhibition like this for the glory of sharing. But actually do really cool things with it. Meaning, imagine if you have no constraints. Let's say everyone gets a gold medal, whatever. Let's imagine everyone gets a great award. You can have people vote on popularity. You can have people vote on all sorts of interesting other ways, not medal criteria. But imagine if you brought three-dimensional cases in, and so you allow everyone to basically be able to put two-dimensional. Even if you collect everything two-dimensionally, and you have one three-dimensional object related to your area of interest, well, why not show it? Like that's the idea. Is I think we're, in a sense, we are when we bring in the public to a philatelic exhibition, it's 100% two-dimensional, and as a result, no one in the public thinks about their world two-dimensionally, but we do. It's very, yeah.
I mean, youngsters collect baseball cards. We know some of them are go for big numbers.
Yeah.
So why can't people collect without being philatelists, saying I'm going to Zulu or cover 79 of a subject?
They do. So that this
is the point. I mean, regardless if he's not put it in the collection or anything like that, you just have to coach people to look after them properly and properly so that they're damaged. But I think that is
from my perspective, if I was made king of the philatelic world today, and I had, I don't know, 2 years to make a change where I was going to be, my head was going to get cut off, what I would say basically is that organized philately worldwide, or at the national level, whatever, should basically pick 3 themes. I think military history is an obvious theme. I think technology or transportation is an obvious theme. And then a third one. At most, no more than 3. And basically, we need to then develop a plan of action action to go engage all of the, I'll use military history as the example because it's my area, to go engage every YouTube channel that focuses on military history. We need to go focus on every reenactor group that focuses on military history, every military show that focuses on military history, and basically find the areas of the interest of these different audiences where the audiences already exist, and bring our material not on display pages, not in the exhibit form, but basically craft our objects into the mode of whatever that field is. Oh, it's a YouTuber? No problem. What's your next YouTube you're doing? Oh, you're doing one on the Battle of the Somme? No problem. Then we go to the entire Philately world and say, who has World War I material from the participants related to that battle? And then we provide that material on a silver platter to that YouTuber. So that's one of like 10 different ideas of how we would do it. But that's how we really actually expand Philately, because as I mentioned in my opening, we have now over 1 million YouTube views from the content created around the exhibition we did last summer. That's more, even if you think about it this way, even if 1%, 10,000 people are impacted by the philately element, that's more people than we impact across decades of our national exhibitions. So the advantage of the world and the internet is it's actually a way to access a massive audience. And we only need to inspire an infinitesimally small number of people. How about not 1%? How about not 1/10 of a percent, 1,000 people? How about 1/100 of a percent? 100 people. Imagine if 1/100 of a percent of the people that watch those YouTube videos say to themselves, holy nuts, I need to find my way of how I collect more of this postal stuff. Can you imagine what 100 new collectors here in South Africa, all at the age of, say, 45 or 50 would do to the market here? So it's a totally achievable objective. What I'm saying out loud is not like pie in the sky nonsense. It's like, how do we execute this? So context philately is simply a way, and on Friday we're going to talk a lot more about this. I have actually not ruined my context philately conversation because the examples we're going to give are not included in this discussion. But it's about how do we think about our own collecting areas? How do we ask ourselves more questions? How do we find other outlets? But also thinking about trying to step aside from ourselves and say, if I'm not a philatelist, what are the questions I would ask about this object? If I'm not a philatelist and I want to get, if we want to get me interested in philately, what are the perspectives? What are my areas of interest? What are the ways I'm going to approach this subject if I'm a military history collector? But I mean, again, the largest military collecting show in the United States is in Louisville, Kentucky. It has 2,000 tables of dealers. It gets like, I don't know, between 10 and 15,000 attendees. The biggest philatelic show in the United States gets about 3,000 to 4,000 attendees. It has, I don't know, 200 tables. So now, is every single person that goes to the military show going to be interested in philately, even if you have a 10-minute one-on-one with them? No. But actually, we only need a very small percentage of them to basically convert over. So the problem in philately, honestly, is we talk to ourselves way too much.
Yes.
We use way too much jargon, way too much lingo, and we get so invested in what we do that it basically drives out our imagination of how we can engage. And so I've tried, my comments are not to say, you are so bad, I'm so good. It happens to me all the time. I often forget that I sort of am so steeped in this that I sort of forget who I'm talking to someone who knows nothing about the Zulu War, knows nothing about collecting. So all my comments here are simply meant to be sort of inspiration. It's like, how do we work together to do more interesting things?
Well, I must commend you on this way of this approach, because we are looking, especially in Pretoria, one of the clubs where I'm involved in new ways in inspiring new people. Of course, not kids in South Africa. We have given up on the kids. I've worked with kids as well. But when I worked with the kids, especially the art students, they take these stamps and they do it for you in ways.
I think it's amazing.
It's for me just the one thing that I need to teach them is please don't stuck the stuff with glue. You need to first be a curator, and then you can do with it what you want.
The one about local clubs and societies, the most important thing I would say, it's a very simple thing, but every club and society that meets in person in the world should always make sure they never have a meeting without having at least one box of one rand value or stamps that basically have no value, so that just in case someone does walk in, there's something to always put in front of them. And that goes for having a box of covers as well. There's a number of stamp societies I walk into your presentation. I simply say, if a beginner walks in here, what would you hand them? And they go, oh, well, we never get a beginner. It's like, well, the problem is that you're not ready for one to arrive. And so even if you could, you're out of luck. The other comment I have, by the way, is, again, it's if you have a local society, if you end up having a presentation that is intentionally about military history or whatever you're going to choose, it's about planning it far enough in advance and attempting to basically have every club member bring a neighbor, bring a friend, bring a classmate, bring a whatever. But the idea is that when you show the presentation that night, the presenter needs to understand that their audience is not philatelic. We have to almost line up our awareness of our audience and design presentations of local societies intentionally for the non-philatelists. Of course, it's going to have lots of philately in it, which is great. But the presentations I see on philatelic subjects are so freaking boring sometimes. And I always think, I love this subject. But I've seen Zulu War, I've seen World War presentations that get into the roots and the unit markings. And yes, that's all exciting and great. But I always think, like, what if we wanted to inspire someone who isn't a philatelist that is interested in the World War? If they saw this presentation, they would never collect postal history. So now I realize that some of the presentations are trying to engage non-philatelists, so I'm not criticizing that, but the idea is that often we include like one map at the beginning and one picture in the middle. No. You have to balance it to really say, what if we were trying to sell someone who's already interested in Anglo-Boer history? Sarah Forsyth is here, she's 28 years old and is surrounded by Anglo-Boer war history. She represents the exact demographic that we love to go after. She's young, she's interested in history already. We don't have to convince her history is interesting. She's in. Now the key is, how do we basically expose and engage? And so, in a sense, I joke with her, she's sort of a focus group of one. A focus group of one here at the show. So everyone that meets you, I'm going to tell them the key is, I want them to figure out what lights your fire. And that's the idea.
So it is actually the on-ramp onto the philatelic highway that you want to create that on-ramp for them.
And once someone's on the on-ramp, once someone's getting off, we've got them forever. Because there's an endless array of things to engage them in. The problem is that philately screws up. I was going to use a much more strong word that starts with a F. We screw up the on-ramp so badly.
Please. We elitists and classist.
Oh yeah.
Yes. There's been a problem.
But it's like it's an elitist perspective that's going to doom the hobby. But I actually see though I'm making these comments that sound very negative, I see so much promise and so much opportunity. And actually, technology is nice to meet you, sir. I'll be here the whole week. There's so much opportunity in philately because it's still so accessible. If all of philately had become like inflation. Inflation's a problem here in South Africa. Imagine if every piece of philately from the stamp that 25 years ago was worthless. Imagine if every philatelic object, no matter how small or how large, was outside the reach of 95% of people who collect. That's a real problem. That's not our problem, though, because 95% of philatelic objects, a child could afford with pocket money. So we actually are benefited by having an incredibly approachable artifact base. At this show right here, for 10, you could probably buy thousands of items at the show for 10 rand or less. That's astonishing. Very few other fields of collecting, especially in the history collecting space, are as affordable, worldwide, as affordable as philately. So in effect, actually, it's hilarious how elitist and classes, it's kind of, I maybe not want to use these words as strongly as I think he meant them, but in a sense, the way that we sort of have done so much that kind of has removed us from the accessibility of philately is startling, because other fields would kill to have our accessibility.
That's right.
And so it's a strange, like paper money collecting and stocks. There are areas that have affordability elements to them, but it's like the affordability. It's like an inverted pyramid where it's a small part of what's accessible is affordable, and the majority of it's very expensive. Coins, in a sense, are not so bad, but it's worse than philately. It's really probably 90% of what's available in philately really can be bought for
next to nothing.
Between 1 to 10 rand.
Yeah. Or 10 rand for a whole box full of.
So you could think about what that means to a beginner. You can collect forever. So if we find a collector gene, a person who has the collector gene, I don't talk about it like a bug or disease. It's a gene. My gene was activated at age 7 when a teacher put some stamps in my hand. There I go. And it was activated again or directed with the Zulu War with the toy soldiers. If you find someone who's already collecting one thing, the key is how do we inspire that redirection or the addition of philately? And it can be done. But it would be a whole hell of a lot harder if what we had in our philatelic world was super expensive. But actually, we know this, that if you say to someone, I'm really interested in pick a topic for under 10 Rand, we could keep them going forever.
Yeah.
There's very few topics that someone could present to us.
But then you have to relate it back to the exhibiting. Because I think people get scared. Helen said to me, she likes this collection, but this one is old medal. And I said, no, I don't think so, because it's not valuable enough.
Right.
So that whole perspective has to be changed.
I told you, but it was a system designed by the marketplace to do several things, to support these in-person experiences, these exhibitions where people can meet and friends can meet each other and whatever. It was the dealers and the auction houses were benefited because it helped prop up the expensive material which was necessary to put in your exhibits to have the importance level or the rarity level, whatever. I'm not saying it's one big cabal and some big conspiracy against everyone. It's what happened. But in a sense, the problem is that the marketplace has changed and the demographics have changed. And in a sense, the part of philately that kept getting stronger and more focused was this high-end exhibiting, FIP and all this other nonsense. And in a sense, the part we sort of forgot about was
Excitement.
how do we get new people to engage?
You don't want them to be embarrassed on their first encounter at a club.
100%.
The club is your school, and you don't want them to be embarrassed.
You're 100% right. And the problem is unfortunately, too many, we talk to ourselves too much. Too many, I'll say philatelists, but it's really a lot of the older generation in particular, they're so hardwired to think about the objective is you get interested, you pick, you specialize, you don't collect 10 different things, you collect your one area, and then you're going to mount it up, and then you're going to have you're going to show it. This sort of progression, it just doesn't make any sense. The most people, it does not make sense for. Even in philately today, even in philately 30 years ago, I would say the height of organized exhibiting is in the 1980s, 1990s, like just unbelievable amounts of subscription to exhibitions. Even at the time, the percentage of philatelists worldwide that were exhibiting at any level, from local to international, was probably less than maybe 3%. So think about that. We basically designed an entire infrastructure, that's where the elitists come, to basically support what amounts to being truly elite philately, the 3%. And while postal administrations issue fewer stamps, while mail, especially here in South Africa, is not really in the hands of the public as much, philately forgot that actually our objective as a hobby, as an entity, as a people, as a togetherness, is around we're the stewards of the material now, but actually it's important that we generate and mentor the stewards of the future. And no one talks about that. Mm-hmm. People talk about it, but then the next 97% of their energy goes to that 3%. It's very weird. And so my whole world is about how to engage young people. I've been doing this with the National Youth Fellowship Program in the United States. I've been working with the British on this. The idea that basically there are things we can do to engage young people, including young people that are already philatelists. So one problem that everyone talks about is how we can't get young people to be, how do we convince more young people to get into philately? We, and I'll include myself as I get older and older, we are not going to convince young people to get into philately. Other young people will. Yeah. So the idea is we need to go out and find the diamonds in the rough, the young, say, under 25-year-olds that are already interested in philately, find a way basically to do anything we can to simply elevate their engagement. So they have no money to come to Peter Maritzburg, they live in the Eastern Cape or whatever, we should find a way to sponsor them to come to the show. They live in wherever, and they don't, young people lack typically autonomy. They can't, they're under 18, so they can't travel or whatever. They lack resources, and they lack connections to understand how they can ask for help, who they can reach out to, who are good potential mentors for them. So we have to bash through that wall, basically, that sits between the traditional philatelic world and young people that are out there. And once you bring in young people, they'll attract each other. As a 20-year-old is going to have a much better time of talking to a 12-year-old about philately than a 38-year-old will to a 12-year-old or a 60-year-old or whatever.
But now the other thing is with the context philately, because it's so multi-dimensional, and I'm not talking only 33-dimensional.
Yeah.
I mean, you bring something in that's hip and cool, and you bring in that young people that has a total different way in describing the world than what you as an almost 40-year-old person do. And that is a far better way of trying to market than any.
It is, the context philately is a way of thinking about the objects of what we collect and we study, but it actually really is a way of thinking about how we should organize philately.
Yes.
That we should be thinking about all the different audiences that we should engage, how do we connect with them. Again, when I worked for the Smithsonian, one of my jobs for across the 5 years that I was there was to go to schools all over the United States and bring postal objects into schools. And so I only was bringing postal objects. That's it. That's all I had. But I had advertising covers. I had letters signed by American presidents. I had a piece of mail that was carried by a slave before the American Civil War. So I used just the postal artifact and told stories and gave context to all of them in a way that when I put them in their hands, that's the other thing is that we too often, sometimes these objects are we don't allow people to be inspired by actually holding it in their hand. And so that's a whole other problem we have, which is actually, this show is very interesting, except not that everyone should be taking their exhibit pages out and handing them to the public, but we've created this weird, truly putting glass between the objects and the public. So if a member of the public comes, they may not know that they can go buy things or they can touch things. It sort of looks like it's all behind glass. And the biggest problem that museums have, in my opinion, one problem museums about their visitorship is that basically they have separated the public from the artifacts of the public's history and heritage. So if you go to Zululand, traditional Zululand today, a Zulu would go to a museum in Talana or on the battlefields. Everything there is in a case. So that the objects of the heritage of the person who's there visiting is inaccessible. Think about the symbolism of that. So this is a whole other thing, is we have the ability of actually putting real artifacts in people's hands because so much of the artifacts are actually cheap, they're inexpensive. We could hand someone a letter from a World War II soldier. It's not going to, the person's not going to hurt it, but even if they do, we're out 27 rand, or whatever. So the premise is that basically we don't do enough to put artifacts in our field into the public's hands, and we need to do more of it. We need to way out of, often context philately, this whole idea is that philately is about the study of objects, and objects are meant to be touched, held. Every philatelic object that any of us have ever collected was held or written or touched by someone at its birth. Gandalf Brahman sat down at Workschrift in April of 1879 and wrote this letter. It would have no significance to us if it was a blank sheet of paper with an 1879 period pen. What does that mean? It's nothing. It's only when it came together as a completed artifact, and now it's an unbelievable thing. But every stamp, even if it's a stamp that we may know is very, very common, in a sense to someone that's never seen it before, to touch and to hold it and to get some explanation of what it is and why it's significant, could change their lives. So, again, I think we talk to ourselves too much. We don't think about ways that we can present our world. We don't think about how inaccessible and how daunting we make our world when someone does engage with us. The premise of Clash of Empires was, yes, of course it was all in cases, but every single day I took stuff out of cases and put it in people's hands. This object was probably held by over 200 people across that show, because basically I was there for every single day across the month, and I would constantly be talking to people. If there was a young person there, and I'm young, let's say under the age of 40, my age or younger, and was looking, oh my gosh, this is amazing, I'd say, do you want to hold a real Zulu shield? And they'd say,
oh, cool.
I'd say, do you want to hold something that was actually at the Battle of Workschrift? Oh my God. You want to hold something that was actually held by Gandalf Brahman? Unbelievable. And I used that moment where the whoa, to basically say, the objects here, the reason why it's in the Royal Philatelic Society in London, is because the postal object is the most directly connected object to a place and a time, because this cancel, because this inscription, because this address. you can much more clearly tell where something has been, where it started and where it went to, whereas this uniform is an example of the period, but don't know where it started or where it ended. And they go, oh, I get it. And no one's like, I don't understand. Every person understood what by the way, when I just said that like 60 seconds, that's all it took. And then someone looks at every single envelope differently. They go, oh my gosh, that was actually there. That was actually with this officer. So this is the nature of kind of what I'm using the Zulu War as a vehicle to try to get everyone to think about this. But going through the exhibits up there are so many perfect examples of things that we could use to engage the public in all sorts of great ways. I mean, obviously the social history exhibits are amazing because those are probably the easiest ones. But actually, there are ones that that have thematic elements to them, or about places like really far away, hard to get to places, and it's like, well, Papua New Guinea, like this started Papua New Guinea. So you're holding. We don't talk about it from a context of the person that's never seen the object before. But when you're holding in your hand, it's from 200 years ago, and it was actually there. And I consider what this means and how difficult it would have been to have had this paper, how expensive this would have been. And let me hand you something else. Now look at this. This was there 100 years ago. Look how different they look. So there's all of these things. All we're going to describe are ways of approaching people and the public. There are billions of people out there. The American Philatelist Society has under 30,000 members, and basically there's 350 million Americans. So my basic comment is, the number of collectors of historical objects of some form, whether they be bottle caps or beer cans or postcards or philatelic objects or military uniforms, is not 30,000, it's millions. Millions of Americans are collectors in some form. What are the odds that we've exhausted the potential of the existing history collecting base in the United States? The odds are zero. We've definitely not exhausted. And that's true here in South Africa also. It's 100% true. The key is we have to get beyond ourselves. We have to open up our minds. We have to engage the public where they are. We have to find more people that have audiences in areas of history, culture, technology, transportation. Go to them and be proactive in saying, YouTubers are always looking for content. Content is king, and they're starving for content. If we can figure out the directions they want to go and help supply the content to them, they're not going to turn it down. It's just about the YouTuber who did the most to help us in our exhibition. Here's the real shot. It's based in Johannesburg. It's South Africa. And he has one of the biggest YouTube channels focused on British military history called Red Coat History. So he's already here. He's already ready to go. He's waiting for someone to basically, I don't know who the right people to connect him with. I'm actually going to see him on Saturday. I'm going to tell him about what I did here. He came to London last summer and did all the filming and blah, blah. If you go to YouTube and type in Clash of Empires Zulu or Zulu Clash of Empires, our whole YouTube channel, everything will show up. But one thing I'm going to go to him is basically say, hey, I was just with a whole bunch of South African philatelists. They were amazing, and they would love to be able to help you with content and images and graphics and things that you want to do for your future videos. What do you have coming up over the next year that you want to do? And I'm hoping he's going to give me a list, and I'm going to go back to Clyde, and I'm going to go back to others and just simply say, we need to gather all of South African philately, and much more imminent and much more important than anything else we're doing, and find postal history objects in this category, this category, this category, this category. And here's the best part. He doesn't necessarily need the physical object. So we just need to get the guy great images and stuff and descriptions to help him be able to interpret these objects. So, I'm giving one of my many ideas here, but why not?